shivering, talking about rain on my lawn. Didn't it, oh, my Lord, didn't it?
The Statue of Liberty has been lighting the way for strangers at our gates since 1884. And before her, this harbor was the welcoming committee. It's seen them all, Serbs, Scots, Danes, Turks, betting their lives that it would be better here. But notice the lady here. She faces the sea. Behind her, over there, are a lot of folks she never welcomed. Theirs was no trip to the promised land. It was hell, with brandings and beatings and filth and starvation. No one knows how many dragged their chains over the side, drowning, rather than submit to a life of slavery. From 1619, when 20 of us were sold by a Dutch ship to the English colony in Jamestown, Virginia, 14 million blacks came in chains to this land of the free. We were the black gold that made fantastic fortunes for those who ran the slave trade. Demands for labor grew with the invention of the cotton gin. Slaves were needed to man the sprawling plantations. You have to understand the particular way that black men and women were viewed in America. To Washington, Patrick Henry, and Jefferson, we were things, not people. And blacks were regarded in their society as animal labor. Why the Constitution considered a slave to be 3/5 of a free man. But as slavery spread across the land, so too did a spirit of black resistance. The rebellions of Denmark Vesey, Gabriel, and Nat Turner revealed that there were men, not animals, in the slave quarters. Henry Highland Garnet, a black prophet, cried, "Rather die free men than live as slaves. Let your motto be resistance, resistance, resistance." Many resisted, and many died. The 13th Amendment of 1865 said slavery shall not exist. And for a brief moment, we dared to dream that our chains were finally gone. At the end of the Civil War, when the federal government opened schools for freed men, 250,000 of them flocked to learn. But when President Hayes removed the Union troops, it was over for us. From then on, it was separate but unequal Southern education, mathematics and languages for the whites, industrial training for the blacks. We saw radicals in the state legislatures of the South open the ballot box and the jury box to include us. But then we saw it all die. A Northern president, Rutherford Hayes, said that absolute justice for the Negro could be got best by trusting the honorable and influential Southern whites. So much for the 13th Amendment. We remained enslaved to lives of ignorance and poverty. The 14th Amendment in 1868 said all men born in the United States were citizens, entitled to equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment of 1870 said that the right to vote could not be denied because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But for almost 100 years, till the passage of the Voting Rights Bill in 1965, we were systematically cheated of that right.
Frederick Douglass becomes a symbol of the liberation of slaves in the country. Frederick Douglass, born a slave, that somehow has the audacity and drive to run away from slavery and decides to become a leader against slavery. So not only does he have the mental capacity to see himself free, he has the audacity to say, I can speak for the slaves better than the abolitionists that speak on our behalf and don't understand our pain.
Frederick Douglass is important to America because, unlike most enslaved people in America, he actually makes it out of slavery, is able to tell his story, and is able to actually become an agent for change in the black community, in America in general.
Frederick Douglass traveled the length and width and breadth of this country as a leading abolitionist that made the issue of slavery a paramount issue through his editing newspapers, through his ceaseless travels and lectures. He helped to make it a real movement that by the time Abe Lincoln is running against Douglass, it is a national discussion. It would not have happened if you didn't have a spokesperson that worked as tirelessly as Frederick Douglass did.
Douglass is someone who is known in this country. He travels to England. He's an international figure. So he's important because he can tell you about slavery, the institution of slavery, because he lived it, and he can speak about that time period. He can tell you about escaping to freedom, and he can tell you about the free world. He bridges gaps. He's a part of transformation of America at this pivotal moment. And it's someone who, as I said, who begins under the cover of slavery and then ends outside of that.
By the late 19th century, segregation of blacks and whites had become an entrenched way of life in the South. In December 1960, another Supreme Court ruling declared segregated restrooms, restaurants, and waiting rooms for interstate bus, train, and plane passengers unconstitutional. 5 months later, that law would be severely tested by Freedom Riders. The Freedom Rides were organized by James Farmer, director of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, a civil rights organization rooted in the philosophy of nonviolence. Farmer, who would be arrested with other Freedom Riders, launched the movement to draw attention to the lack of enforcement of recent civil rights court decisions and legislation. As Farmer's volunteers rode into the South, the campaign gained support from civil rights leaders like Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King, Jr. When the riders arrived in Atlanta, King praised them for their nonviolent, direct action, but he warned of trouble ahead. "You'll never make it through Alabama," he predicted. Activist John Lewis, now a congressman from Georgia, was then a 21-year-old divinity student. He was the first of the Freedom Riders to be attacked when he and a fellow white rider tried to enter a whites-only waiting room at a Greyhound terminal in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Traveling deeper into the South, to Mississippi and Alabama, singing spirituals and freedom songs, the riders were met with hostility, arrest, and more violence. One of the most frightening attacks occurred a few miles outside Anniston, Alabama, on May 14, 1961. A Greyhound bus carrying Freedom Riders was forced off the road by a white mob who stoned and firebombed the bus. The passengers barely escaped the burning vehicle. That same day, several of the Freedom Riders arriving at the Trailways bus depot in Birmingham suffered savage and bloody assaults. Among several beaten by the Ku Klux Klan was 61-year-old Walter Bergman, a college professor from Detroit. Undaunted, he urged others to join the cause and strike while the iron is hot. His fellow rider, Reverend B. Elton Cox, an outspoken minister from North Carolina, also remained defiant, saying he preferred death to segregation. Jim Swerg, a 21-year-old studying to be a congregational minister, was the victim of an ambush attack a week later at the Greyhound bus station in Montgomery, Alabama. Screaming, "Nigger lover," the mob pummeled him, fracturing his teeth and injuring his back. Trained in nonviolence, like his co-riders, he never struck back. As the vicious attacks on the Freedom Riders continued, the National Guard was called out. When hundreds of supporters of the Freedom Rides assembled at Montgomery's First Baptist Church with Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, an angry mob gathered outside. The National Guard patrolled the besieged church during the long, tense night. At times, however, Lewis recalled, the guards, with their bayoneted rifles, looked like the enemy. With their presence, the violence was quelled, but hostility awaited the riders as they arrived in Jackson. When black riders tried to enter a white waiting room, or white riders tried to use facilities designated for blacks, local police officers ordered them out. If the riders refused to leave, they were immediately arrested and charged with breach of peace. As the Freedom Riders were taken into custody in Jackson, they did not resist. Some bailed out of jail, but many, in a show of commitment to their cause, refused to be bailed out. The jail, no bail tactic, adopted by scores of those arrested, would burden Mississippi's penal system for months. Here's Martin Luther King, Jr.
Never in the history of this nation have so many people been arrested for the cause of freedom and human dignity.
While hundreds of Freedom Riders endured hot, dirty prison cells, civil rights leaders appealed to Washington. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had hoped for a quick end to the protests, and especially the violence. Finally, Kennedy pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission, the agency that regulated interstate travel, to issue a new and stronger ruling banning segregated facilities. The ruling went into effect on November 1st, 1961. It would still be many years before segregation would end completely, but the Freedom Riders had won a major battle in the war against racism.
August 28, 1963. 250,000 Americans, black and white, young and old, descend on the nation's capital in a show of solidarity. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but it would be remembered as a turning point in the fight for civil rights. Among the speakers, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who electrified the crowd with his stirring "I Have a Dream" speech.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
A few months earlier, racial tensions in the Deep South had erupted. News reports carried brutal images of fire hoses blasting at the backs of school children. President Kennedy had finally seen enough. In June of 1963, he presented sweeping civil rights legislation to Congress. Dr. King and others hoped a massive yet peaceful demonstration in Washington would spur passage of the bill. The city braced for violence, but their fears proved unfounded. The day of the march, more than 200,000 people gathered for a rally at the Washington Monument. It was the largest demonstration in the country's history. Arm in arm, they walked from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There, performers as diverse as Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson lent their voices to the cause. Martin Luther King Jr. was the last to take the stage. He began with a reference to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves a century earlier.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Partway through, King put aside his prepared text and shared with the protesters his dream of equal rights for all.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
February is Black History Month. But why? Where did Black History Month come from? It began with this man, Carter G. Woodson, a historian and writer. Woodson noticed that his people were, quote, overlooked, ignored, and even suppressed by the writers of history textbooks and the teachers who use them, end quote. So he started a Black History Week in 1926, and people celebrated it enthusiastically. They started Black History clubs, and teachers started recognizing the contributions of Black Americans in their classrooms. He chose February, by the way, because it held the birthdays of both Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, two men he believed had done tremendous work for the rights and liberties of African Americans. It took another 50 years, though, for Black History Month to become officially recognized by our government. The president at the time, Gerald Ford, said that we should seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. Here's the funny thing, though. Carter G. Woodson hoped that someday people would no longer celebrate Black History Month. He saw the day when it would no longer be necessary, when finally we would see Black history in America for what it really is, an essential part of American history.
I hear this one a lot. How can there be so many races in the world if we are all descendants of Adam and Eve? Well, check this out. First off, let's talk about the word race. Sometimes when people use the word, they mean supposed races of people who have evolved at different times, rates, and in different locations. That's not true. Of course, the word race is also a term we use to distinguish between groups with different physical traits, namely skin color. But are there really different races? Take a gander at Acts 17:26, where it is written that God, from one man, made every nation of men. It's clear then that the Bible teaches that there is one race, the human race. The Bible is also clear that all people on the earth are descendants of Adam and Eve who were created by God. Check Genesis 1:26 through 28. Easy enough. God created two people in his image, male and female, and told them to increase in number. So, Adam and Eve are mom and dad of the human race. Then, their children had children, and those children had children, and so on and so forth for many generations until, according to Genesis 6:9, the world's population was reduced to 8 people who were protected inside an ark during a global flood. And those 8 people later walked off the ark, and according to Genesis 9:19, from them came the people who were scattered over the earth. Well, wait a second. What do I mean scattered? Well, jump over to Genesis 11 and let's talk about an event known as the Tower of Babel. Basically, because of the sinful actions of the descendants of Noah, the Lord confused their language and scattered them from there over all the earth. That's pretty clear and concise. Okay, so we've got lots of people who were descendants of the 8 folks who came off the ark, and now they have been scattered all over the earth. That explains that we are still one race and that different groups of people ended up in different locations. But how do we get a bunch of different colored people if we are all one race? Well, follow along. This, of course, is a simplified explanation, but the basic principles are true. We all have a pigment in our bodies called melanin, which, depending on different variables, produces different shades of the one main skin color we all possess. Several genes control the amount of melanin produced and thus the variability in the skin shade. In fact, it's easy for one couple to produce a wide range of skin shade variability in just one generation, as we'll see in just a moment. Time for a quick genetics lesson. DNA is the molecule of heredity that is passed from parents to children. A child inherits 23 chromosomes from each parent. Each chromosome pair contains hundreds of genes, which regulate the physical development of the child. However, to illustrate basic genetic principles pertaining to the topic, we'll just talk about 2 genes, the genes that control the production of melanin. So, let capital A and capital B symbolize versions of the gene that code for large amounts of melanin, while little a and little b code for small amounts. Got it? Easy. Check this out. Take a look at the upper left. Let's say Dad contributes capital A, capital B genes, and Mom contributes capital A, capital B genes as well. Together they will produce a child with capital A, capital A, capital B, and capital B. This is a kid with a lot of melanin, and thus he will have very dark skin. Easy to see. Here's the bigger point though. Let's say Dad contributes capital A, capital B, and Mom contributes little a and little b. Well, the child's skin will be middle brown shade, the combination of capital A, little a, and capital B, little b, which, by the way, represents a majority of the world's population. Not only that, but if each parent is capital A, little a, capital B, little b, the combinations that could be produced in their children could result in a very wide range of skin shades in just one generation. Ooh. So, since Adam and Eve were the first people ever, it makes sense to conclude that God placed in them a combination of genes that could produce all different shades of skin we see. Those same combinations would be present in Noah and the 7 other people who boarded the ark. And because God dispersed people at the Tower of Babel, he dispersed the population, thereby isolating gene pools in the different people groups. Over time, different cultures formed in different locations with certain features like skin shade becoming predominant. And here we are today. And since we all go back to Noah and his family, it makes sense that we are all different shades of brown. One race, multiple people groups, just like the Bible teaches. Simplified for sure, but enough said.
If I landed in prison for calling on God's name, He would cause the walls to crumble under the fervor of my praise. For the cause of Christ I'm chosen to suffer death to prove